Omerta is a Sicilian term for a code of silence, honor, and non-cooperation with authorities, particularly in the context of organized crime.
I don't know nothing about that.
You go no further, just say nothing else. This is what I'm telling you, what I'm exposing to you and the press and everybody. This is my doom.
Omerta is a piece of shit if you don't agree to it. If you don't agree to it, it's nothing.
Okay, but what is it supposed to be?
It's supposed to be silence.
What are we told? We're told that no matter what happens in that life.
But I said that it's a double-edged sword.
You can't have your own interpretation of Omerta. It is what it is. Omerta is, you never know. I'm not saying.
I told you.
It is what it is.
I agree
You
with
can't
you.
talk, period.
Originating in southern Italy and most commonly associated with the mafia, the concept of omerta has spread to other organized crime groups, serving as a crucial tool for maintaining secrecy and protecting members from prosecution. Members swear to omerta, usually involving a secret blood ritual, to become made into a crime family, and it means that they must never inform authorities or rivals about the group's secrets.
Take that oath. This is what my father's opinion was. Michael, I don't care who betrayed me. I don't care who ratted on me. I don't care how bad the life was. I took an oath, and I couldn't live with myself if I betrayed that oath. I don't care what anybody else did. That's it, and I'll live this way until I die.
Did you do anything for the family at all in this time,
Yeah,
or did they just do things for you?
Just go out, kill for them.
You'd go out what?
Kill for them.
The code is so strict that anyone who speaks to police or their families are marked for death and torture. To enforce omerta, the mafia used fear-based psychological tactics, such as the constant threat of violent retribution to ensure silence. By discouraging dissent and forbidding cooperation, omerta effectively breeds an us versus them mentality, further binding its members and strengthening the social structure and hierarchy within the group. Criminals operating under the Code of Omerta exploit and leverage family bonds by threatening and targeting the family members of rule breakers. The case of Tommaso Buscetta, a high-ranking mobster who testified against the Sicilian mafia, is an example of this type of intimidation tactic. After mafia hitmen killed his brother, two of his sons, and various extended family members and close friends, Buscetta walked away from the criminal organization he'd been part of for nearly all his life. A key informant in the largest mafia trial in history, Buscetta was among the first to break omerta and explain the mob's inner workings, which led to some 400 convictions. His family was systematically wiped out before he broke omerta, highlighting the extreme measures taken to enforce the code and punish those who betray it by violently murdering the people closest to them. Just as the threat of violent retribution, the code of silence also extends beyond the individual group member and includes his family as well. Wives, children, siblings are obligated to stay silent out of fear and loyalty. This extension of omerta to family members creates an environment of shared secrecy enforced by fear, which unsurprisingly often permeates into wider neighborhoods or communities where these clandestine groups brazenly operate.
Hat on. Thanks, John. Who?
Gotti, who else?
For what?
For having this big party.
Yeah? You know anything about John Gotti?
No. If I did, I wouldn't say anyway.
Often as a result of omerta, unaffiliated individuals in the community may feel obligated to refrain from reporting crimes, even if they are victims or witnesses of crimes. I'm going to say that one more time. Unaffiliated individuals may feel obligated to refrain from reporting crimes, even if they are victims or witnesses.
In this case, with the high-profile nature and having people decline to talk to us presents a whole set of challenges that we have to find a way to work through. And having people decline to talk to us presents a whole set of challenges.
If you don't want to say nothing, that's your bet. But don't say I'm leaking anything. I paid that bill. Sent my daughter to college to get an education. She came back in the box, and I can speak on that.
Omerta prioritizes group loyalty and silence over moral responsibility and justice. This posed significant challenges for anti-mafia law enforcement, hindering investigations at the expense of truth and justice. But the innovation of investigative tools and tactics, like the Witness Protection Program, wiretapping, and undercover operations, allowed law enforcement to gather evidence without relying on direct testimony. These tactics, as well as the testimonies of high-profile turncoats like Tommaso Buscetta and Joe Valachi, marked a turning point in mafia investigations, enabling authorities to bypass Omerta to some extent and make inroads into previously untouchable organizations.
You sat with agents. That's breaking Omerta.
I said I broke it. I betrayed my oath.
Yeah, and you talked about your crimes and everything else. That's
Talked about my
cooperating, and
crimes.
that's a rat.
Are you a rat?
If that's the term you like to use, I don't look at myself as that. I look at it as I was betrayed, I betrayed him. That's what the mob is. Just like everybody else who cooperated.
You gotta understand.
It doesn't have to mean that you took the stand.
Sammy,
Once you break that oath, you broke it.
But I already agreed to that.
Yeah,
I
well,
betrayed my oath.
yeah.
My thing was, I'll talk to the government, but I'm not gonna put anybody in prison. I'm not gonna go
It's
to
not
that
your
extent.
call.
But to credit Omerta as the sole reason the mafia was able to flourish in the criminal underworld for decades ignores the fundamental factor crucial to the success of any clandestine crime network, and that is the ability to corrupt politicians, policemen, and judges.
Of a definite ring or group of people who are engaged in professional crime, as you have described throughout your testimony? Yeah, I'm talking about a definite syndicate operation tied up all over the country and outside of this country too, that strictly starts with gambling. It all starts with gambling. All starts with gambling. Without gambling, they got nothing. And you say they cannot operate without the police knowing about it? They cannot operate without it. And do you find that they do actually have police protection where they operate? Positively.
And I also proved with my investigation, like in Boston, there was a connection between the FBI in Youngstown and the mob. The mob paid off the FBI in Youngstown for years and covered it up just like they did in Boston. And my God, we had a FBI director by the name of Hoover testified before the Senate, said there's no mafia in America. This is nothing but a fairy tale. And the truth of the matter is, the mafia had him in pictures of drag, dressed as a woman, and compromised J. Edgar Hoover.
An important historical example to understanding how organized criminal groups gain control of politicians and authorities is the sexual blackmail of J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI from 1924 until he died in 1972. During most of his 48-year career reign as FBI director, Hoover refused to investigate the mob and flatly denied its existence and national structure despite public criticism and outrage. Hoover insisted that gambling, prostitution, drug smuggling, and Prohibition-era alcohol rackets were simply local problems, and that local and state authorities should take the lead to address these crimes, choosing instead to unlawfully investigate, conduct surveillance, and pursue his political opponents and anyone he considered to be a communist. Hoover's denial of a national mob structure was due largely in part to the mafia's use of sexual blackmail against him. Well-known mobster Meyer Lansky was credited with obtaining compromising images of Hoover sometime in the 1940s, which later wound up in the hands of the CIA. This allowed the organized criminal world to flourish economically and politically, the impacts of which we are still dealing with and clearly are seen today in the well-being of our country. The sordid, symbiotic relationship between U.S. intelligence and organized crime is assiduously documented in Whitney Webb's One Nation Under Blackmail. It's an eye-opener, and I recommend everyone grab a copy.
We've told the public very clearly from the beginning that we believe it was a targeted attack. I mean, to be honest, you're going to have to trust us on that at this point because we're not going to release why we think that.
That's all I really want to talk about right now because I actually have a class here in like 15 minutes.
Do you have any theories of your own?
I don't know. The way everything got brought out was really weird, in my opinion. As far as how the 911 call was made like 8 hours later, I just think the timeline is very strange.
By now, I'm sure you've already made several connections between the broader concept of omerta and the Idaho 4. The psychological impact and behavior of community members, the deafening silence and deflection of witnesses and family members of the victims, and the refusal of law enforcement to keep the public properly informed throughout the investigation and prosecution of Brian all reflect cooperation with and adherence to omerta from top to bottom. Since day one, Moscow authorities and the U of I have adhered to the code of silence, adopting an us versus them mentality by maligning the public at large, misrepresenting genuine interest and well-placed concern as nonsense and conspiracy theories. The possibility that these murders are related to organized crime or anything other than a one-off crime of passion was promptly shut down in the days after the murders by city officials like Mayor Art Bedke when he described the murders as, quote, very focused and doesn't involve other students or the public in general at all, end quote. Even the Chapin family, their first public statement included a denial of any drug angle. And what about the coroner declaring that toxicology reports aren't relevant in this case? These patterns are reminiscent of Hoover's hear no evil, see no evil attitude towards organized crime in the 1940s and 50s, denying existence of a systemic problem and thereby running cover for clandestine networks. This adds credibility to the belief that Moscow is compromised or in cahoots with the drug trafficking syndicate operating in the shadows of their community. It appears the town, the university, local law enforcement, and even the victims by proxy are tangled up in a web of organized criminality, which ultimately is the genesis for this atrocity. Hence the refusal to acknowledge, let alone investigate or address the underlying causes like drug and human trafficking.
Is human trafficking occurring in Kootenai County? No. Are there people that live in different parts of this country or this world that are soliciting our teenagers to get naked pictures, sextortion events? That's happening daily, and it's probably happened since we've started this show. That is absolutely. And does that situation put that teenager at risk for being a victim of a crime and human trafficking in the future? You're damn straight it
Absolutely.
does. Yeah. So we need to bring that to a community conversation also. Is human trafficking occurring in Kootenai County? No.
Please don't get distracted by the conspiracy theories, and I'll just be perfectly blunt. The nonsense that some people put out there just to stir the pot, that hurts the families all the more. That hurts the community all the more.
Looking around, looking at the timeline when things happened, it turns out that this is a one-time event at one particular location. This does not carry on to the larger community.
police knowing that? They cannot operate with it. And do you find that they do actually have police protection where they operate? Positively.
Any new details?
Nothing that I can share.
How was the crime scene?
I can't talk about it. Everybody's working together. The investigation is still active, absolutely.
How long they're going to stay here at the home?
Don't know, as long as they need to.
We knew what we needed to do. I said from the very beginning, we will protect the integrity of this case. Mm-hmm. And we did that. And I think a lot of people realize that now.
But we didn't just witness the effects of this phenomenon in the aftermath and response, but I truly believe the murders were in part executed as a consequence of multiple violations of the Code of Silence, namely cooperation with authorities, a sin punishable by death and torture under Omerta. With regard to motive, it's been clear to me for quite some time that these murders were in fact a meticulously planned hit intended to silence the victims, retaliate against their family members involved in drug trafficking who had turned informants, as well as to send an explicit message of intimidation to the criminal underworld operating in Moscow, specifically aimed at its freelance army of college dealers. To quickly summarize the timeline of relevant events, Maddie's father, Ben Mogan, was charged with felony possession with intent to deliver twice in the year 2020, both cases resulting in plea agreements with Kootenai County prosecutors. As a result, Mr. Mogan avoided years, possibly decades, behind bars pursuant to Idaho's strict drug sentencing guidelines. Xana's mom, Kara Kernodle, was caught with the same felony drug trafficking charges the following year in August of 2021. And Maddie's stepmom, Corey Hatrock, got jammed up herself in June of 2022. Both ladies made plea agreements with Kootenai County prosecutors a week apart from one another in early September 2022. The timeline of Corey Hatrock and Kara Kernodle's plea agreements coincide with the massive drug bust associated with the arrest of Tyson Farley and Tanya Rhodes, redistributors from Moscow believed to be associated with the Idaho street gang, the Aryan Knights. Not long after his arrest, Tyson Farley was oddly released from custody on furlough a month and a half before the murders took place. A warrant was put out for his arrest, and he was picked up on trafficking charges in Spokane and extradited back to Latah County on November 23, 2022. 1 month after the King Road massacre, Farley made a plea agreement with the help of his public defender, Kathy Mabbitt, who, as we know, also happens to be the coroner and is a graduate of the UI College of Law and was employed there as a professor. Farley's plea agreement lines up perfectly with an unexplained uptick in the surveillance and warrant activity of Brian Kohberger in the Idaho 4 investigation. We believe Farley gave Latah County the name Brian Kohberger, which is why Bill Thompson flatly refused to clarify the genesis of the investigation into Kohberger. Farley merely received probation and he was released from custody a couple months later in March of 23, despite being caught with a pound of meth back in September, his repeat offender status, and the fact that he skipped furlough. Meanwhile, during that same 2 to 3 month period of time leading up to the murders, and while Farley was roaming the streets on furlough, the feds were investigating the Aryan family trafficking ring operating out of the Tacoma, Washington area. This investigation lasted a total of 18 months and was really heating up in October and November with the use of confidential informants, physical surveillance, and wiretaps. This investigation culminated in the execution of search warrants on December 9, 2022, and ultimately the mass indictment in March of 2023. Notably, this mass indictment occurred just 6 days after the fentanyl poisoning death of U of I student Caden Young in the same area of Western Washington. As we know, Moscow's main dealers, Emma Bailey and Demetrius Robinson, were charged in association with Young's death, only for their charges to be mysteriously dropped by the prosecutor a couple months later, leading many to speculate that Emma and Dee provided information on their suppliers to escape the consequences of providing Young with the lethal dose of fentanyl. And if we are to take that speculation one step further, what if Caden was murdered because of what he may have known about the Idaho 4 massacre? As a journalism major and the former president of Alpha Kappa Lambda, which is the fraternity that the Banfield boys are from, Caden could have very likely had the curiosity and temerity to uncover the truth. The timing of his death near the eve of the mass indictment, coupled with his direct proximity to Emma Bailey and the Banfield boys, who were not far from the crime scene at the time of the murders with terrified looks on their faces, makes me wonder if Caden had a story to tell about that night. Remember, Young didn't die of an overdose of cocaine, but he was poisoned with fentanyl, and no one was held accountable. Despite an admittedly complex web of information, characters, and timelines, the theory here is straightforward and logical. When Maddie's father and stepmother, as well as Xana's mother, made plea agreements for drug trafficking charges in Kootenai County between 2020 and 2022, they likely gave information to authorities who were actively pursuing the suppliers of this multi-state operation. The Aryan family prison gang who had taken over this Arizona to Tacoma trafficking route after the 2021 arrests of the Fetty Bros were the target of this investigation. As a result of their apparent cooperation with the feds, the parents of Maddie and Xana violated the code of silence and non-cooperation, and in accordance with Omerta, they needed to be dealt with. However, as shown throughout the court records, the feds were hot on their trail, surveilling their targets physically and digitally through wiretaps during this time. As such, the hit had to be covert and indirect. A bloody attack on the informant's college-aged children accomplishes the goal of retaliation and intimidation. The orders came from the top, but I have a feeling these attacks were likely planned and carried out mostly by local criminals, some of whom were bound by their own fraternal bonds and oaths of silence. In addition to boots on the ground, this criminal syndicate also enjoyed the cooperation of law enforcement, who would fulfill their obligations of fabricating a timeline, a narrative, and evidence to orchestrate this entire cover-up. Targeting that well-known house, torturing and murdering those victims with such brutality, cleaning up afterwards and leaving the bodies in the rooms of Xana and Maddie specifically, the children of the informants, would send a loud and clear message to insiders. Outsiders with little intimate knowledge of the local criminal underworld would respond to the targeted massacre with paralyzing confusion and fear, which left the general population vulnerable to law enforcement and the media's manipulation tactics. The narrative crafters and perpetuators know that critical thinking and rational analysis are often overridden during heightened states of emotion, leaving the community and general population far more suggestible and willing to accept the chosen conclusion, even in the face of evidence tampering and statements wrought with confirmation bias and propaganda tactics.
Frustrating because we want answers to know what happened, but they're holding back a lot of information from us.
This is why the community was left in the dark for weeks following the murders, so officials could come up with their psychopathic incel, lone wolf killer narrative that shifted responsibility to the individual rather than on a community level. In this way, Brian Kohberger became Moscow's scapegoat, a concept that has its roots in religious rituals where a goat was symbolically burdened with the sins of a community and then sent away into the woods. By constructing a narrative based on little more than the imagined sexual fantasy and fabricated obsessions of an outsider like Brian Kohberger, the community avoids scrutiny that would surely end in the exposure of some serious corruption and criminal activity, in my opinion, whether it's through bribery, blackmail, or out of allegiances to the university. It's clear that public officials and cops in Moscow act in the interests of organized crime rather than the safety and well-being of its residents.
So, Your Honor, at the end, the state submits the evidence that I've given just a quick overview of, and that to present in court would consume weeks, which the state is prepared to do and has been prepared to do, would show that as the defendant has just admitted and pleaded guilty on November 13th, 2022, Ms. Kohberger entered the residence at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho. He did that with the intent to kill. We will not represent that he intended to commit all of the murders that he did that night, but we know that that is what resulted, and that he then killed intentionally, willfully, deliberately, with premeditation, and with malice forethought, Manny Mogan, Kaylee Gonzalez, Ethan Chapin, and Santa Colonel. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've laid out to you why I believe at least 2 of the victims were targeted. I have ideas for why Kaylee and Ethan were killed, and I do not believe they were victims of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, as Howard Bloom insists. I believe Kaylee's murder is associated with money laundering and the crash of FTX 5 days before the murders. I believe that Ethan was offered as a firstborn sacrifice. I believe it was planned that all 4 victims would die that night in pairs and at predetermined times and places for complex reasons, which I believe include esoteric purposes specific to these victims. This was a ritual, the kind that involves murder, which humans have been practicing since antiquity. And while I may have lost some of you with these statements, it couldn't be clearer to me that we're dealing with ritual magic here in at least some capacity. This case is dripping in occult symbolism and Masonic messages that don't occur randomly. This is the darker part of the case that cannot be ignored or lazily dismissed if we're going to get to the whole truth of the matter.
I want to let the court know that there are over 400 potential witnesses in the innocence phase alone. I personally and my team have talked to less than 10%, well, less than 10% of those witnesses.
We've established what omerta is, its brutal consequences on individual rule breakers and their families, as well as its permeating effect on communities, leaving silenced victims and prosperous criminals in its wake. We also know that Moscow is a drug trafficking hub because of its strategic location and market of college students, especially in Greek life. It's a fact that Moscow police, FBI, University of Idaho, and local officials covered these murders up. We witnessed it with our own eyes. So it's by no means a leap to suggest that local, state, and federal authorities collaborated in their efforts to cover for one or more clandestine criminal networks. I guess this sounds far-fetched to folks who watch mainstream media and haven't studied American politics or history, because newsflash, our government has always covered for the Brotherhood.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein?
But how do we know that this specific drug trafficking organization even abides by omerta? That's a good question, because my theory about the motive and modus operandi of the King Road killers isn't based on assumptions or cheap stereotypes like the state of Idaho's. It's the federal court documents for the March 2023 indictment of Jesse James Bailey and Associates that offers a nexus between this trafficking ring and the Code of Omerta, and what inspired me to make a video on this topic in the first place. As it turns out, there is a prominent prison gang in Washington called Omerta, which is associated with and has pretty much combined with the Aryan family prison gang in Washington, D.C. U.S. attorneys described this trafficking ring, the group that was indicted in March of 23, in the following footnote. While investigators have referred to this organization as the Aryan Family / Omerta DTO, that's drug trafficking organization, investigators have learned during the investigation that this DTO is more expansive and has more associates, including sources of supply. For consistency, investigators will continue to refer to this organization as the Aryan Family / Omerta DTO. But I'm going to let a former Aryan family member explain to you the relationship between the two prison gangs.
There's this other thing we were talking about, man. There's I don't know anything about it. It's the first time I ever heard of it, man. A group called Omerta up there.
Oh, yeah. They're actually pretty big right now.
And Are they Italian? Are they white, Mexican?
Well, Tony Phelps, Joe Kelly, and Nugget, they started a group in the joint called Omerta, right? And it was originally a bunch of just white boys, gangster white boys from Snohomish County, which is north of, about 30 minutes north of Seattle, right? So it kind of just started off as like a little clique, a bunch of boys from, the 425, the Everett, Snohomish County area, and then it kind of around 2011 is when I started to notice a lot of AF dudes, like my boy Roland Virgil. He was AF, but he had Omerta tattooed on the back of his neck, because all the Omerta dudes had Omerta right on the back of their neck between their shoulder blades. Right, that's where they got it. And so I was like, "Hey, dog, why the fuck you got? Why you rocking that?" He's like, "Oh man, I'm kind of trying to make it a hybrid thing." And I was like, "What?" Yeah, right. And I was like, and at that point, that's kind of when I was like already kind of losing my whole fucking luster about the whole AF, because like here this young kid. About a year later, I'm in the hole, and I hear some talk about we might be going and having some beef with the Omerta dudes, right? And I'm like, for what? And because some guys were leaving, going to Omerta, blah, blah, blah. I think Omerta was kind of becoming a little bit more popular because at that point, a lot of AF dudes were like a lot of the original dudes were getting poked up and stabbed, right? And getting forced out. So that didn't make us look good. One, who wants to fucking join an organization where you're just going to end up getting forced out in 10 years? So we were already, the family was already struggling at that point. And, and then around 2013, I had already dropped out at that point, but 2013, 2014 is when the AF and the Norteños went to war. So from 2014 to like 2017, it was head up on site anywhere you went, Norteños and AF. Well, that right there pretty much wiped out the AF as far as numbers. Because anytime you get certified as AF, they're sticking you in the hole. So, there weren't a lot of guys on mainline anymore. And, I think that's kind of when Omerta just kind of took over, man. And so last I heard, they were kind of running shit. I don't know if that's still true. Probably not. Maybe it is. I don't know. But
were they...
They're a much more violent group of individuals.
And the evidence seems to support our friend here's assertion that these Omerta guys are particularly violent and may even perhaps be involved in a familiar pagan practice that many of us know as Odinism. Calling back to the Delphi case, you'll remember that this bastardized version of Norse paganism is rather common in prisons, especially among these white supremacy gangs. You'll also recall that this practice sometimes involves human and animal sacrifices. And here is where things get really interesting. Brandon Gerner, also known by his street name Shooter, is a career criminal from Western Washington, and he's cited in court documents for his own double homicide case as the founder of the Omerta prison gang. On November 16th, 2023, a year after the King Road homicides almost to the day, Germer and two of his Omerta associates, Joshua Jones and Cody Olson, were allegedly involved in a double homicide, as well as the killing of multiple animals, including a beloved therapy horse, which, get this, was apparently offered as a sacrifice to Odin.
Members of a white supremacist gang charged in a double homicide in Maple Valley just appeared in court. Brandon Gerner and Joshua Jones pleaded not guilty to several felony charges.
Court documents reveal that one of her suspected killers, Brandon Gerner, is the founder of the Omerta white supremacist prison gang. The other suspected killer, Joshua Jones, also a member of that gang.
Police say these three men, Joshua Jones, Brandon Gerner, and Cody Olson, are behind a double murder in King County, and one of these men is also responsible for killing a horse in Pierce County. On November 16th, 2023, the bodies of 57-year-old Robert Leroy Riley and 34-year-old Ashley Williams were found in bushes under trash and debris in Maple Valley.
As I'm walking, I see a pile of what I thought was garbage over there in the brush. Looking at it, and I'm like, is that a mannequin? And I looked again, and I'm like, no. So I started hollering, thinking, are they alive? What's going on? So I started hollering and got no response.
Then, less than a month later, on December 12th, Pierce County deputies chased Cody Olson after a reported DUI traffic stop. It ended in a shootout on Vickery Road. 2 deputies were hurt. Olson was shot and hurt. And 4 days later, on December 16th, Olson died from his injuries in the shootout. A vigil was held for him that night. Only hours later, on December 17th, a beloved horse named Lemon was shot around 12:30 in the morning on the same road where the shootout and vigil happened, Vickery Road.
Shooter is a very sadistic individual, man. He doesn't care about other people at all. You know, he calls you his brother, but he'll stab you in the back.
Yeah, that's not a good leader at all.
I hate that dude, man. I fucking hate him. I used to be good friends with Shooter. Shooter used to call me from the fucking hole at Walla Walla, and we'd sit there and talk shit on the phone for hours. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Not hours. We only got an hour out. But, I mean, dude, it just makes me sick that I considered that dude a friend of mine at one point.
The male victim, Mr. Riley, was living in a trailer located in a fenced-in area on the commercial property of Andy Crippen, who owned a contracting business and would employ Gerner and Jones from time to time. There are conflicting reports of whether they had permission to be there that night, but Mr. Crippen confirmed that the only people who should have been at the property overnight are the victims, Mr. Riley and Miss Williams. At around 1 a.m. on November 16th, Mr. Riley sent a text message to Mr. Crippen that read, quote, "Hey, Andy, what's up? Is that you at the shop? I see a whole bunch of guys out there," end quote. This was the last correspondence from Mr. Riley's phone. A witness who knew Gerner and Olson personally told police they heard that the man who lived on the property confronted Gerner and Olson at his gate and pointed a gun at Gerner's head. Gerner, in turn, instructed Olson to shoot Mr. Riley. Olson then shot the victim in the chest. He was later found to have a single penetrating gunshot wound to the left side of his chest. After realizing there were cameras on the property, Olson and Gerner went inside the victim's trailer to retrieve them, where they encountered the second victim, Ashley Williams. She was a mother of 5 and had just recently began dating Mr. Riley. By all accounts, she was simply at the wrong place at the wrong time. The witness said Olson told him that Gerner began to stab the woman as she begged for her life. Olson told the witness that he shot the woman because the knife Gerner was using had broken and the woman was suffering. Another witness told police that Gerner admitted to shooting a dog on the property and stealing approximately a pound of meth. That's what makes me think this was intended as more of a robbery than a consensual drug deal gone wrong, as hypothesized in initial reporting. Joshua Jones was up in the parking lot with his girlfriend while the murders were happening. After hearing gunshots, Jones allegedly advised his girlfriend to leave, and he stayed behind with Gerner and Olson. A woman named Jessica Hall was called to the scene to give them a ride after the murders and disposal of the bodies. Jones admitted to watching out for police in the parking lot and eventually copped to helping load the bodies of the victims and the dog into the bed of the truck, using a wheelbarrow and a tarp to do so. Upon discovering the decedents, police were initially stumped and appealed for help from the public, speaking to several key witnesses who provided information despite expressing fear for their lives. A geofence warrant was also issued, which helped lead them to the killers. Also, a lot of information was learned after the officer-involved shooting death of Cody Olson in December, and police were finally ready to move in and arrest Gerner and Jones in early February. After failing to establish contact with the targets, police published a bulletin on February 6, 2024, stating that they had probable cause to arrest Gerner and Jones in the murders of Mr. Riley and Miss Williams. Clearly feeling the pressure, Gerner told a witness that he needed to kill Jessica Hall, the woman who showed up to the crime scene to give them a ride. Less than 2 days after that bulletin was published, a 911 call was placed from Jessica Hall's residence at approximately 4 a.m. on February 8, 2024. According to reports, 3 masked, armed persons had attempted to force open the front door at Hall's residence and then fled in a dark blue Ford truck. This attempted break-in was captured on multiple home security videos. Later that same evening, at about 10 p.m., one of Hall's neighbors called to report 3 persons in front of Hall's residence, causing a disturbance. The subjects fled before police responded. A review of surveillance video in the neighborhood showed 3 persons who had arrived in a white Ford Expedition. The following day, Gerner was apprehended and taken into custody. He denied committing the murders or shooting the dog, conveniently blaming it all on Olson. According to the PCA, Gerner admitted to police that he dumped the bodies in some bushes in a nearby residential neighborhood. He also said he threw the firearm in the river. Jones admitted to disposing of the body of the dog at a construction site and eventually copped to helping dispose of the bodies. Both men have pled not guilty. If you aren't connecting some of the dots here, let me help you out. First, let's take a look at the attack on Ashley. Armed home invasion, brutal knife attack, no sexual assault, bodies moved to mislead authorities. The type of violence employed here is instrumental in nature, and it's the same type of attack that was perpetrated against the Idaho 4 victims. What I mean by this is the aggressive act is calculated and purposeful, serving as a means to an end. In other words, it's violence used to achieve a specific goal, like gaining money, power, or control, rather than being driven by a particular emotion like anger or fear. Robbery, burglary, and some forms of sexual assault can be considered instrumental violence when the primary motivation is to obtain something like money or control. Individuals with psychopathic traits may be more likely to engage in this type of attack because they lack empathy and remorse, making it easier for them to use aggression and violence to achieve their goals. There has been a lot of discussion and contradicting information over the injuries sustained by the Idaho 4. While the state claims that this elusive K-bar was the sole murder weapon, I beg to differ and question how they could have definitively arrived at this conclusion unless they were framing Kohberger. Based on the information we have, it's not off the table that the victims were shot either. Take this audio clip discovered by Bubbly Waters in Pavarotti. At 3:44 a.m., someone racks a firearm and then slams the trunk closed. A couple minutes later, they head towards the crime scene. Also, remember what Christy Gonzalez said about the panicked call she received from her niece that morning, finding out her daughter was killed?
She's like, I think Kaylee's dead. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she
all
said,
of our stomachs just dropped.
She said there was somebody just called me and they live down there. And she said there was a party last night and somebody went in and shot the party up and Kaylee was shot. I was like, what? And I just threw my phone.
The obvious retort to this would be, but TCD, we've never learned anything about finding bullets. And that's correct, but you know what there was evidence of? Injuries that were unique to Kaylee, described by the coroner to Steve Gonzalez as, quote, big open gouges, end quote, and significantly more brutal than Madison's.
Their means of death don't match.
Maddie's
They don't.
and Kaylee's cause of death, it does not match based on the autopsy report.
They don't match.
We've heard all the rumors of organ removal to pay down drug debts, and considering the language used to describe such injuries, I'd say bullet removal doesn't necessarily sound too far-fetched. We also heard from the Gonsalves family that Kaylee was beaten in the face and head to the point where her nose was broken and her face left unrecognizable, raising the possibility that a handgun could have been used as a blunt weapon in the attack. All this to say that I highly doubt the intruders entered the house with just a knife. There were likely firearms involved. Whether they were used with a suppressor or not is up for consideration. I also want to bring up a contradiction pertaining to Xana's injuries. Shortly after Brian's arrest, one of the elusive, quote, sources close to the investigation, end quote, leaked information to the public that Xana, quote, repeatedly grabbed the attacker's knife, so much so that she sustained deep cuts to her fingers, and that her fingers were nearly severed off, end quote. Just like all the information disclosed to the public in this way, this statement had a purpose pertaining to narrative control. However, there's a contradiction here as indicated by forensics expert Joseph Scott Morgan.
And I asked if any of the victims had been slashed. And she seemed to be very clear that these were all stab wounds. But these sources are saying that, Ethan had been slashed, that his neck had been slashed, and that was the original injury he received. I guess the same question for you. Can those two things still be true? Can a coroner consider a slash a stab?
Not only is the injury to the neck a slash, allegedly, according to this person, but these injuries that you're talking about on the hands, these are going to be incised wounds as well. Not necessarily slashes, but this is as a result of grabbing hold of the blade and pulling it through the hand. These are not stab wounds. I can tell you that definitively based upon my experience. So yeah, there probably are some stab wounds, but that information is, you need more clarity here.
Given these inconsistencies, I can suggest that maybe these weren't defensive wounds, but rather mutilation to send a message. The act of cutting off fingers in the context of cartel violence carries specific meanings, including punishment and warning, intimidation and psychological warfare, and symbolic messaging. Specifically, cutting off an index finger might signify punishment for informing authorities. All of these themes line directly up with what we've been talking about and are supported by the timeline and criminal procedural history of Xana's mom. So I can suggest that information was put out there by law enforcement and disseminated by Ashley Banfield as a means of damage control. Okay, so back to the Maple Valley double homicide. I also have to reference the witness intimidation of Jessica Hall, who called 911 when a group of 3 armed, masked men attempted to break into her home at approximately 4 a.m., as well as numerous attempts thereafter in which they used several different vehicles. Gerner told a witness about his intention to kill Hall, obviously feeling the pressure of his impending arrest. This is textbook omerta enforcement, just like the Idaho 4. Common elements of modus operandi include the use of 3 men, just like the unknown male DNA suggests, wearing masks as Dylan artistically represented, employing surveillance and using multiple different vehicles, as evidenced by the Banfield body cam, all for the purposes of witness intimidation and silencing in the context of a high-stakes police investigation.
He's back in county right now for shooting some dude and then killing a horse. Yeah, the horse was a sacrifice to Odin, apparently.
Yeah. Okay, these guys got it all fucked up. They don't even know what they're practicing.
You see what I mean, bro? This is like the type of shit that I'm just like... Yeah, guys like that, that's disgusting. I don't even know how he got out, to be honest with you, because he had crazy time, dude. If I was in his organization at one of the higher levels, I'd try to have him done, because that's like up there with being a weirdo, dude. I don't respect it.
And that was just a bullshit excuse he made up as a sacrifice to Odin. It's like I listen to these guys talk and I'm just going, what fucking literature did you guys read?
The worst part about it all is that horse was a therapy horse for like kids with special needs.
That adds more to it, dude.
Yeah, he's a real dirtbag, dude.
Wow.
Yeah, as if it couldn't get any worse, right?
Another chilling overlap here is that Moscow and the University of Idaho have a strange and disturbing history of targeted animal cruelty. Each incident promptly written off by Moscow police despite the clear menacing intent behind such acts of violence. The obvious one that comes to mind is Buddy, a mini Australian shepherd who was snatched from his yard in Moscow and killed, his body left manually skinned and filleted. Buddy's owners Pamela and Jim Colbert said that a Latah County Sheriff's deputy told her the skinning wasn't done by an animal. Shortly before Buddy's death, Jim Colbert also found a mutilated rabbit close to his home, noting that the poor animal's scalp and ears were sheared off. Despite the couple's concerns and disturbing reports, Moscow police dismissed Buddy's death as wildlife activity and unrelated to the murders. Pam Colbert stated, quote, "They cut him around the neck and just skinned him," unquote. She said they found his collar, but they didn't find the pelt, which reminded me of this image, which has mostly been scrubbed from the internet, of Kaylee's balcony. Murphy's dog bed can be seen with what appears to be brown and black fur. This incident always stood out to me because of an eerie pattern of events I picked up on early on. The month before her murder, Kaylee posted a TikTok dancing with her beloved dog Murphy. The post is dated October 18th. 3 days later, Buddy was snatched from his home and killed 3 miles from the crime scene 3 weeks before the murders occurred. This has ritual and targeted intimidation written all over it, just like the MO of the King Road killers. All of this taking place, by the way, in the context of Kaylee complaining of possibly having a stalker, feeling like she's being followed, and reports that Kaylee was hypervigilant about human trafficking. Meanwhile, no connection has ever been made between Brian and supposedly his victims, and the state even conceded that there was no evidence that he had been stalking them. But yeah, nothing to see here. Let's just forget about these disturbing patterns of violence and unaddressed concerns. I can, however, place members of our drug trafficking ring, Bryson Gill, Michael Slocum, Michael Warren, and Isaac Cervantes, around Moscow on October 19th, 2 days before Buddy was found. The 4 drug traffickers took a trip down to Arizona in late October 2022, while their phones were being tracked by the DEA. They left their stash house in Western Washington on October 18th, and they took the long way, bringing them right by Moscow through Pullman and eventually to Boise, where their phones were tracked on October 19th. In my opinion, they took this longer route so they could meet up with their Aryan Knights associates in Idaho. The 4 arrived in Arizona on the 20th, and Buddy is found the next day on the 21st. Was a message passed along from Gill to Idaho's top redistributors that needed to be shared with campus dealers in a covert act of intimidation? Another series of similarly disturbing animal-related incidents on UI's campus happened back in January-February 2017, when 7 dead coyotes were left on fraternity and sorority doorsteps in 2 separate incidents. The coyotes' bodies were left mangled and mutilated, and blood was menacingly smeared on the windows, with Pi Beta Phi, the sorority that Maddie, Xana, Bethany, Emily, and apparently Dylan were all in. Kaylee's sorority Alpha Phi was also targeted here. When these coyote killings happened, Moscow police completely refused to investigate the matter, once again blatantly running cover for criminality, stating that the coyotes appeared to be shot, which isn't illegal in Idaho, and this was probably just someone playing a prank. Imagine sending your kid to college and something like this happens where they live, only for the police to flat out refuse to investigate whether there was criminal intent or a credible threat involved. It's truly astonishing. These incidents can be looked at as microcosms for exactly what happened on the morning of November 13th. Disturbing death event happens. Cops establish the narrative that will result in the cleanest optics, whether that's suicide, accidental drowning, overdose, wildlife activity, incel serial killer. You know the drill. They reject all other possibilities and refuse to investigate further. The community is left confused and traumatized, but eventually they'll let it go, and into the memory hole it goes until the next disturbing incident occurs, and they wonder if this bizarre event is connected to the previous one, which of course is deemed as conspiratorial wrongthink that the overlords immediately shut down, shaming anyone for pondering such a thought while refusing to back up their assertions with facts and evidence. Over time, residents become demoralized, accepting that they don't deserve what should be the bare minimum from police. In this way, authorities, narrative controllers, and complicit media corporations and social media sellouts can alter reality and history to their liking without having to provide any proof to the masses. That is exactly why this case was never going to go to trial. Thinking about these incidents, especially the quadruple homicide, from the perspective of an organized crime hit, though, In the context of the feds closing in on this multi-state ring that was supplying the very house where this occurred, all of these unexplained, dismissed, intentionally hidden, and contradicting pieces of information begin to sort themselves out and make a whole lot of sense, as I've shown you throughout this presentation. Suddenly, Moscow doesn't look so much like the charming, bucolic college town it presents itself as, does it? So how much longer are Americans going to tolerate this abuse from state-sponsored gangsters? When are we going to turn off our televisions and demand actual answers supported by thorough investigations, authenticated evidence, accountable authorities, and the right to challenge all of it in a court of law pursuant to due process? How come the law only seems to apply to the poor, the drug addicted, and the vulnerable, so they can be used as pawns for police and prosecutorial agendas? How do we reconcile the ethical dilemma of leveraging one's freedom, safety, substance use disorders, and even the well-being of their families in exchange for investigative information? Communities like Moscow will never be released from the ruthless grip of organized crime as long as the Code of Omerta is still enforced and abided by, from the citizens to the criminals, and especially the powerful few that call the shots, where cops run cover for criminals at the expense of the citizens who pay their salaries and whose safety they disregard as they brazenly infringe upon our rights and lie to our faces. The atrocity on King Road exposed Moscow elites' utter contempt for the people, as evidenced by their willingness to lie, manipulate, and exploit, then erase the evidence of this tragedy. As witnesses ourselves, we must do better than silence. For the victims of violent crime, the falsely accused, and countless citizens desperate for a better life freed from the clutches of fear and criminality.